Yeah, thanks again, Brian. Katie is going to be giving our next talk on the Nature Conservancy's climate resiliency, science strategies and planning. So Katie Barlow is the lead for TNC's Managing for Resilience strategy in the Central Appalachians program, which spans the Appalachian Mountains from Pennsylvania to Tennessee. She is also the current coordinator for the Central Appalachians Spruce Restoration Initiative, which is a partnership of conservation agencies and organizations dedicated to restoring red spruce forests. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, she received a PhD in ecology at Penn State, conducting research on restoration challenges and opportunities resulting from unconventional gas development and the rhetoric of environmental decision-making tied to reclamation regulations. So thanks, Katie, for being with us today.
Thanks, Maddie. Are you seeing my presenter view or are you seeing the slide? Good to go?
The slide, yeah, that's good.
Okay, great, thanks. So hi, everyone. My name is Katie Barlow. I work for the Nature Conservancy's Central Appalachians program based in West Virginia. And we've heard some really incredible presentations from forest health and ecosystem dynamics and management. And I'll be presenting on some of TNC's approaches to using a systems approach for how we approach climate resiliency and how we use science and ecological strategies to plan for climate resilience. So some of my objectives for this talk are to, one, share our working conceptual frameworks for managing for climate resilience and provide some concrete examples. And also to highlight how forest management can address climate change impacts by assessing the need at the landscape scale and then moving to the site level to implement management. So thinking at both scales. So here's my outline for what I'm going to walk through today. So I'll start off with some of the foundational science that TNC and partners have developed on climate resiliency. And then move to some of the ecological strategies that we're working on to manage for resilient systems on resilient lands. And then how we use science and strategy to develop management plans. So I'll start off with the foundational science. So this map of the resilient connected network is TNC's foundational science for planning for climate resilience to preserve biodiversity and functioning ecosystems. TNC has joined global, national, and local governments and nonprofit partners to work towards the ambitious goal of protecting 30% of the Earth's lands and waters by 2030. To accomplish this goal, we need to work collaboratively and strategically to protect the 30% of the Earth that is to be resilient to climate change. So to inform how we know which places to protect, the Nature Conservancy's Center for Resilient Conservation Science has spent the last 10 years working on a resilient and connected network analysis for the United States to map the places most resilient to climate change. This resilient connected landscapes map is the blueprint for TNC's Protecting Land and Water strategy, and it guides our internal priorities and is growing amongst our partners as a guide for land protection and management. So this was a large group effort. As this analysis was tailored to each specific ecoregion, we had the input of experts on region-specific steering committees to serve as advisors to adjust the analysis to fit each unique geography. So how the model was run in West Virginia was different from how the model was run in the Midwest, say in Iowa. In total, we had over 250 scientists from the Nature Conservancy, other nonprofits, natural heritage programs, universities, state and federal agencies that helped us craft this analysis. So to identify those places that are likely to sustain biodiversity in a changing climate, they identified three critical ingredients. First, resilient lands. So the lands with many connected microclimates representing all the physical environments. Permeable landscapes, knowing that a connected landscape allows for movement and facilitates range shifts. And third, resilient systems and species. Together, these three factors form the resilient connected landscapes. So let's start with resilient lands. So The resilient connected landscapes is based off of the theory of conserving nature's stage, that species distributions are tied to the underlying geology and elevation. So to conserve a full spectrum of biodiversity, you need to protect all of these different geophysical settings. For the resilient connected landscapes, they have comprehensively mapped geophysical settings based off of geology, elevation, topography, and hydrology. And then within each geophysical setting, mapped the areas that have the most microclimates and are the most connected to a local neighborhood. So here's a map of the results of the continental US. For all three of these maps, the green areas are above average resilient. The yellow are average and the brown below average. They combined the landscape diversity map, the local connectedness map, both of which are assessed for each geophysical setting, and average the landscape diversity and the local connectedness together in a map of resilient sites. So the resilient sites, which you see here in green on the map, are the sites where we expect to continue. These places will continue to support biological diversity, productivity, and ecological function, even as they respond to a changing climate. So let's move on to the second ingredient, permeable landscapes. A permeable landscape is a connected landscape that allows for movement and facilitates range shifts, which we know will be critical for species climate migrations and adaptations. So the map that you're seeing here, this climate migrations in motion map, uses a different suite of data, but it's a great illustration for species movement in a changing climate. What went into the resilient connected network was a model of climate flow that used wall-to-wall connectivity method that incorporated climate flow, local connectedness, and flow upslope, downslope, and northward flow. So this is the resulting map where you see in blue the diffuse climate areas. So many options for flow in these natural landscapes. The orange areas are areas of concentrated flow, where the flow is funneled through small corridors or pinch points, such as north of the Monongahela National Forest. And the white and gray areas are areas of blocked flow. So the last ingredient, the resilient systems and species. So resilient systems and species are intact habitats, unique communities, and rare species populations that together represent the important biodiversity areas of the continental US. So this data was primarily drawn from TNC's ecoregional plans. The ecoregional plans are TNC's conservation priorities for each ecoregion. With the added terrestrial data from state wildlife action plans, and where available, we added unique biodiversity targets. So here's the map of the recognized biodiversity. The lightest green are the state wildlife action plans and other data. The middle green are TNC's portfolio, and the darkest green are the areas of overlap between both data sets. So to build the resilient and connected network, they combined these three ingredients: site resilience, climate flow, and biodiversity, confirmed biodiversity, together. And where they overlap, we have the resilient and connected network. So everyone can access this data. The easiest way is to go to our website and explore the web map. You can also, our tool, and then you can also explore the web map on ArcGIS Online, or you can even download the data yourself and look at it on your own platforms. I have some more resources at the end of the talk if anyone is interested. Okay, so we've just talked about the foundational science that guides our planning for where we work. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we work on those places, those resilient sites, our strategies for managing for climate resilience. To start off, what is resilience? In ecology, it's typically defined as a measure of the capacity of an ecosystem to regain its fundamental structure, processes, and functioning despite stresses, disturbances, or invasive species. So basically, how does the ecosystem respond to disturbances that are out of the norm? So when we're thinking about managing for resilience, managing for climate resilience, number one, we're going to start with the resilient connected lands network, the science that this foundational science that I've just shared. These are the places that have the best capacity to maintain or be resilient with diverse, productive, and ecologically functional systems with climate change. But on those sites, it doesn't necessarily tell us how to manage for resilient systems on those sites. So we need to think about, from the field of ecology, what are the key ecological attributes that will confer resilient systems if we manage for those attributes. And broadly in the field of ecology, we know that those attributes are landscape connectivity, landscape biodiversity, ecological functions, such as hydrology, and adaptive capacity of species and systems. So therefore, our strategy to manage for resilient systems on resilient sites is to manage for these attributes and the ecosystem services that benefit human communities. So I'll go into depth for two of these attributes, for connectivity and for intrinsic adaptive capacity. So for connectivity, these are three of the main types of landscape connectivity. You may have diffuse connectivity through a broad natural area. You may have channelized connectivity, where species have a limited range of movement. And you'll have impeded connectivity with much of our anthropogenic impact on the landscape. So why is connectivity important to think about in terms of resilience? So connectivity enables species movement for maintaining ecosystem functions and gene flow for maintaining biodiversity. As we saw earlier with the migrations and motion map, species will be moving northward, range shifts. We need to make sure that connectivity is there. And there are many different management options to enhance connectivity, whether it's increasing patch connectivity, expanding patches, or connecting patches. So here I'd like to give you an example of how we're assessing climate resilience at the landscape scale to develop actions for the site scale. So at the landscape scale is a scenario that's familiar to probably most of you that live in the Central Alps with extensive coal mining, as you can see in this time lapse of forest loss in West Virginia, and Kentucky. It has directly impacted or land use change has, minelands have been the largest driver of land use change in the Central Appalachians, which has directly impacted over 1.5 million acres. So we're working currently on a project to identify where we could restore degraded minelands and aglands at the landscape scale, that if we restored these, they would enhance the landscape connectivity. So for example, here in a map of West Virginia, Western Maryland, and Pennsylvania, we have a key pinch point in the resilient and connected lands from the Mon up into Pennsylvania. And where I have highlighted here in this red circle are places where there's been a lot of degradation due to mining. And so we're looking at this landscape scale to identify places where we could enhance connectivity by restoring key places in the landscape. So another attribute, adaptive capacity. So how vulnerable a species or a system is depends on its climate exposure, its sensitivity, and therefore the potential impact of the species. And in addition, its adaptive capacity to a changing climate. So if we have, if adaptive capacity is the intrinsic capacity of a species or system to disperse the genetic diversity that it has to adapt, the raw materials to adapt over time to a changing climate, and we factor in any extrinsic components of the system, whether it be invasive species or habitat loss, we do have options in management to adapt, to help these species and systems adapt to a changing climate, be it through its adaptive capacity. So I'm going to give you an example. I'll tell you a story of how we're using this adaptive capacity approach at the landscape scale with impacts or with approaches that are at the site level in the spruce fir ecosystem in the Appalachians. So to think about adaptive capacity of a single species, when we think about where the optimal sources for that species, we want to consider the genetic diversity of that species. We want to consider the genetic load, and we also want to consider the local adaptation. And for spruce, for red spruce, we know from data collected by the University of Vermont's Ecological Genomics Lab that the genetic diversity in the Central Alps is very low. And so in order to enhance the adaptive capacity, we need to maximize genetic diversity. And while doing that, we need to make sure that the sources we're sourcing from are not going to insert any deleterious alleles that would negatively affect that species. So in this first project that we did, we were taking the landscape approach of what's the concern with the need at the landscape scale. And then we used the data to point out places in the landscape where we would be enhancing genetic diversity and minimizing genetic load. So I know that those are not red spruce cones, but it was limited in cartoon icons. So the places where you see the cones are the places where we sourced seed for the 3 restoration sites across the Central Alps and put in over or close to 60,000 trees, red spruce trees this past spring. So the science that we had at the time was enabled us to maximize genetic diversity and minimize genetic load, but we didn't yet have the data to optimize local adaptation, but now we do. So we're using that same approach, but adding on the ability to optimize local adaptation with a new modeling effort on genetic offset. And how this modeling effort works is you can enter choose a time period that will be related to the gas emissions scenario. And you can choose a planting location, and the app will model the suitable places. I've got an example here to source seed based on the genetic offset. So basically how adapted the genome is to the future changing climate of that place. So we now are currently in the process of using local knowledge and local skills for cone collection, and these models that are helping us find these optimal sources for genetic diversity, minimizing genetic load, and optimizing local adaptation. And so in the future, we'll have seed sources to plant for our restoration sites. So finally, I would like to get into a little bit of planning, thinking around these concepts. So first, if we're thinking about approaching a managing for resilience framework, number one, again, we're going to work in those places where we know that these lands have the best capacity to maintain or be resilient in the face of climate change. And second, we're going to be looking to manage for resilient systems by enhancing these key ecological attributes for resilience. So here, I'm going to just give a few examples from the Deer Creek area. And you see the star there in the Mon with a high amount of climate flow with confirmed diversity in this area. So we might think about, in the Deer Creek, we might think about connectivity. You see where the red arrow is, there's fairly decent connectivity. Maybe we'd want to focus on enhancing climate flow more towards the west. There's significant biodiversity, and this project area represents a unique opportunity for us to think about systems that are new to us in this area. And we might think about adaptive capacity. We know that many of these oak systems, the dry mesic oak, dry oak pine, have high adaptive capacity, and so there's an opportunity to manage for the future conditions. So we might start off with thinking about which ecological attributes are of interest to this area, which would matter to future resilience. And then we could start to refine those ecological attributes, going from broad to specific. So connectivity for what species, connectivity for what system. And for biodiversity, we might refine it to what is do an assessment on structural complexity of the forests in this area, and keep moving down to what is specific and important and relevant to that area. And then we'd state clear values-focused objectives. So what do we want? The reference conditions show us many different options, but we take those reference conditions and apply it through an approach of what do we want in the future, and make our decisions based on that. And then we can determine our measurable attributes of these ecological attributes, and then assess the current condition to help us make future decisions. So we may have, once we have the attributes to measure, we may consider different strategies and tactics, like increasing options in the landscape, such as increasing habitat connectivity. We may work on restoring processes, such as decompacting soil. We may nurture sources of renewal, like a prescription for regeneration. And then across the board, we want to think about where there are overlaps and trade-offs. So for example, in management A, scenario A represented in blue, we may have a greater benefit of connectivity, but less in an intrinsic adaptive capacity. And the opposite may be true for management option B. We may have an increased adaptive capacity, but it may have some impact on biodiversity and connectivity. So we need to think about the solutions in a holistic way of where we can maybe find areas of overlap, but be able to think through the trade-offs and plan in such a way, which will lead us to prioritizing for certain actions across the landscape. And of course, take a adaptive management approach where we take action and then adapt over time. So as we think about the science, the strategies, and the planning that can go into managing for climate resilience, scale is really important. And I think we need to be thinking of ways that we can think at that landscape scale, such as how we're doing for connectivity around degraded minelands, and then adaptive capacity with red spruce, and take actions at the landscape scale or at the site scale where it's appropriate. And we're really excited about this Deer Creek project. It's an exciting landscape to be working in, given the potential for climate flow and the unique biodiversity that we have here in the Deer Creek project area. So if not now, in the future, we'd love to receive your questions, comments, and feedback. And my email is here if you would like to connect with me. So I can take any questions. I'll open the chat, see what's there.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. Yeah, go ahead and unmute if you have a question, and we'll monitor the chat box.
I can ask a question to the group. I'd love to hear from any of the participants if like how you think at the landscape scale to plan for site level management.
We need an audio clip of crickets.
Katie, I just engage my partners that know a lot more about that stuff than I do.
Shane, I'm looking forward to a walk in Deer Creek with you to think about these things.
Absolutely.
That's great. And I would just chime in that there are a number of tools and resources that are available to different audiences and different scales to think about how you can take this information about climate change and figure out what to do with it, no matter where you're managing your forests and what you're managing them for. And these tools and resources are really complementary to each other. Oftentimes we are really focused on thinking about our particular place on the landscape, whether it's 50 acres or 100 acres or even 100,000 acres sometimes. And it's hard to blow it up and think about these landscape level ideas and how where you are in that particular place really fits into all of this connectivity and flow and biodiversity on a much bigger scale. And so this information is a really, really great way to expand our thinking on this topic. And West Virginia is just one of those amazing, unique places where, you know, this stuff really matters and you have that intense biodiversity and a range of habitats in such a small location.
I think, you know, on that note, Patricia, it's helped us to start somewhere with one of these attributes, like to start with connectivity. And sometimes we'll go down the rabbit hole of, well, it's not just connectivity, it's all these other things. And we just have to keep bringing ourselves back to, let's try to just answer this one piece of the puzzle. And often that starts to help us think about other pieces of the puzzle to get us being able to start thinking, taking this massive problem down to one component.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of pieces of the puzzle, just because we have time for some more questions, I was wondering if you could revisit, you probably explained it really well and I just need to review it, but can you re-explain like the concept of minimizing genetic load?
Sure, I did kind of gloss over that. So the challenge with you know, sourcing from different places to restore genetic diversity in a particular location, you want that genetic diversity to be the raw materials to evolve and adapt over time, but you don't want to source from places that are going to have an inbreeding effect or an inbreeding depression effect on that population. So they have the ability to look across the genome and all the populations that they've sampled. So where there are deleterious alleles, they've pulled those out so that we weren't sourcing from those places that had deleterious alleles, which would be the genetic load.
Awesome, thank you.
Need to unmute. I think I know the answer to this, Katie, but you talked about the resilient landscapes and those places that were likely to be biologically resilient in a changing climate. And I was just wondering how much of a focus in that work is looking at future climates, if any, or you know, what's going on there?
That's a great question. So it's a model of what has led to diversity, productivity, and function on the landscape. So that's why it's number one in our stepwise process of how to think through how is that science. So number two, we have to use climate vulnerability and exposure. So vulnerability is exposure, but we have to use climate vulnerability to then take the next steps to manage for resilient systems on those sites that have shown to be resilient over time. that answer the question?
I do. Yeah, I think it helps me visualize. I think that the resilient landscapes is really showing you where the potential is to
Exactly.
make good choices about where to manage. And then in those places where you have the ability to manage, then you can use resources that look at climate change vulnerability of the species there, and then figure out how to implement adaptation strategies for those
Exactly.
areas.
You restated it quite clearly.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around, but yeah, that's a really great way to think about it in a complementary kind of way.